Hello and welcome. We are live today on the Desktop Developer Show. I'm Walt Richer, and I'm here with my co-host, Billy Hollis. Hello, Billy. How are you doing?
Walt, doing great. Thank you.
I understand you got a UI tip for us later in the show. Give me a 10-second summary of what you're doing.
Yeah, I really like some of the interaction patterns that desktop native platforms do. One of them that came up in Windows Phone and is in Windows 10 today is what's called a jump list. And so I wrote actually a control for older technology, WPF in this case, and I'm going to show that particular pattern and talk a little bit about places that people might put it in their apps.
That sounds nice. So be sure and stick around and stay to the end of the show to hear Billy's tip of the week. And now let's introduce our main guest. Today we have Rockford Lhotka on the show. Rocky, I'll get you here center screen. Hello, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm excited to have you on the show. We've had many great conversations in the past about Windows and UI and desktop applications, and I knew you'd be a perfect choice for the first guest on the show. So thanks for joining us.
No, I appreciate it very much.
And somehow I wouldn't have expected this, but that poster that says Rocky on the wall somehow just makes your office.
Well, there's a story, if I can. Just so I had a few years ago some real serious health issues and a major surgery, and so the team and the folks that report to me at Magenic got that poster. They all signed it, and so that was kind of a get well gift when I came out of the surgery. So that was I framed it. That's touching.
Oh, that's very cool. Very cool.
I keep clicking on the wrong buttons here. I'm still learning StreamYard. So Billy, I understand you and Rocky have had a long relationship. Didn't you work on a book or something together?
Well, a few books actually. I can actually tell the story of when it began. He and I both did our first major speaking at what was then called VBITS, now VS Live, in 1999. And I sat down to Rocky. Well, there was a speaker event, and I sat down to him next to him on the bus, and we introduced each other and got to know each other. And then it wasn't that much later that we wrote these books right here, including the one on the left there, which was the first book published on VB.NET. And boy, that was an intense effort, Rocky, to get that written on the beta.
I think we wrote the whole thing in roughly 6 weeks, a little more. And boy, I look at the pictures on the cover and I think, wow, were we really that young?
Yeah.
So that's incredible to think about writing a book nowadays in 6 weeks.
Well, we had just a little bit of familiarization with the concepts, but yeah, and it's even harder than you think in some respects, because at that time in beta 1 of the .NET platform, they really didn't have any documentation. I don't know about you, Rocky, but it was pretty much autocomplete was my...
Oh, yeah, totally. Yep, it was just a lot of experimentation and guesswork and IntelliSense autocomplete and both of us, I think, had some connection with the product teams at the time, and but of course they were busy too. They were writing the product, so it was.
They wouldn't always answer your emails.
No, definitely not.
But I don't know about. Of course, you've had lots of great selling books. That was the best selling book I've ever written. And
no, it was a pretty amazing book. Yeah, the timing could not have been better.
So you'd already written several books by that point on your CLSA framework or VB objects or whatever the original book?
Back then they were called the Business Objects book series. Right.
Yeah. So did that help when you were writing the book on Visual Basic? Did that help did you use any of your examples from your own framework?
No, not examples. What helped is that I'd written like maybe 4 books at that point, and writing books is a skill that you also develop. And so by the time that Billy and I were writing this book, I had become a pretty good author. So, I didn't need you learn how to write so that your editors don't rewrite everything that you write, basically.
We didn't have time for a lot of that.
Yeah, I've been there too. My book was a lot smaller than any of yours, I have to say. So, Rocky, I understand that you've created applications on a lot of different operating systems over the years. Is that a true statement?
That is. Yeah, I started I suppose technically I started on integer Apple, but that I don't know if that counts. So I wrote software for IBM PCs, DEC VAXs, Unix, Linux, Windows. So I've targeted quite a number of operating systems. Yeah.
And I would guess that the majority of that though has been on the Windows operating system. Of your work.
Well, at this point in my career, yeah. I spent the first almost decade working on VT terminals with mostly DEC VAX or PDP-11 type computers. So for a period of time, of course, in my career, it's like, I did a lot on the mini computers, but now, yes, you're right. I look back and I'm like, well, that was a minority compared to everything else I've done, which is mostly Windows.
All right. So where I'm going with this is this is the desktop developer show. So I mean, we tend to focus on apps that are written specifically as like an OS specific app. And is there any? But the web has come in and changed a lot of things over the last 20 years. Is there a reason why you continue to write your apps mainly as Windows application, at least the business layer?
I think that having a great user experience is super critical. And for a long time, the web was primarily, and some people still do it this way, where it's essentially a mainframe. It's a 3270 mainframe terminal with a lot of color and graphics. But the user fills out a form, they hit the transmit key, or nowadays they click the post button or whatever, save, and it sends the form back to the mainframe, web server, to be processed. And that's fine. Obviously, it works, right? That's and you look at all the unemployment systems that are crashing today, written in COBOL. They use that architecture. Oh, that's mean. That was mean, but it's not a great user experience, right? And in fact, that's and you can tell that users don't like it because the web with Angular and React and whatnot has almost completely shifted. All modern web development tends to be smart client development, just running in the browser.
Okay, so no, I was just checking the stream on the side monitor to see if we had any questions for you. I'm still learning how to use this software, this StreamYard software.
Well, while you're doing that, I can ramble just a little bit more.
Okay.
I do think that we're in an interesting point because of the fact that web development has largely shifted to essentially use smart client concepts. Building a modern web app with Angular, for example, conceptually isn't all that different from writing a Windows Forms app. The tool chains are all different and everything else, but what I'm getting at is from an architecture perspective, you're actually writing your entire app in TypeScript and just calling services. And so it's kind of like client server VB or Windows Forms, VB6. It's all the same stuff, right? Same architecture. And so I think where we are today, at least in my mind, is there's kind of three competing models. There's the old style web/mainframe model that still exists, right? ASP, MVC, or Razor Pages, where you're really writing a server-side app that projects into a terminal, and the browser's a terminal, and then there's this world where the browser is the runtime. The browser is essentially the operating system. And then the third is native apps. So still writing for Windows or for Mac or for Android, and so really those are the three models that we're all faced with. You have to choose between those today, is what I'm getting at.
For the front end, but you could certainly have a back end that supported more of those models. I think it's fairly typical in our world for us to construct business logic that's kind of behind the service layer, and then do a desktop type app for people inside the firewall, and we do a web app for consumers and such, and mobile app for remote people, etc. Do you see that as a model that's widespread to use all of these different ways of projecting the user interface based on the same business layers in the back, or are we kind of an outlier? Are we not the typical case for corporate America?
I hate to say it, Billy, but I think you're kind of an outlier. Magenic, we've got, and I don't have an exact count, but well over 100 projects running right now, and across the U.S. and very few, if any of them, are multi-UI. Sometimes what will happen, well, first I should back off and say, well, almost all of them use some sort of web UI. So they either use use the browser as a terminal, or more likely they use the browser as a runtime, so Angular or React. And sometimes we end up also building mobile UI for some small subset of the overall app, right? So the enterprise, an enterprise app usually has hundreds of screens, if not more. And mobile apps usually have like a dozen screens, right? And so I can't think of a case, for example, where we've built parity between our website or the web apps and a mobile app. So the mobile app's always some sort of subset for very, very targeted user scenarios.
Yeah, that's pretty much the way we look at it too, that all three of those different ones, mobile, web, desktop, are targeting different groups of users. So you project different numbers of screens, different functionality to each one. And I don't mind being an outlier. Outliers make more money if people find you and you can do things other people can't do. But it's frustrated me at times because it's not that hard. We did one of the first big projects that we did, and which we did the back end, and we got all the business logic, and we did the internal desktop stuff, and then we added the web section for a certain number of users. It had to do with prescriptions, so it was refilling and some other things, doing prescriptions through the web for the customers. We only spent 8% more to add that web functionality to an already developed system, and so doing multiple UI doesn't look to us like it costs that much more.
Yeah, I think if you're an 8% increase, if you're talking about a $2, $3, $4 million project, is quite a bit of money, and it's not just during the development. I think it's also you figure enterprise systems last 15 or 20 years, and so then you're talking 8% maintenance burden over all that time. And so at the end of the day, it's not. I don't think it's a developer thing. I think a lot of developers would enjoy doing the variety. I do, but at the end of the day, I think it's an economic choice where, especially, and this is the thing that I think is something worth recognizing, is that modern browsers have enough access to the operating system or the hardware to do most line of business apps without. Basically, why would you create a native app? And you would create a native app because you need features that are only available directly through the OS or the hardware. Something the browser blocks you from doing. That's one good reason. Another is I want to be deployed through the store, which on desktops is rarely the case. That's almost always a negative. But on phones, it's often perceived as a positive. It's like, yay, I'm in the store. And but for apps that don't require hardware access and don't require OS features that you can't get through the browser, which we need to be clear, right? I mean, through the browser, you can get location services, you can get the camera. So, but there are a lot of things you can't. And so that ultimately becomes kind of the decision process. It's like, geez, if what I'm doing, like in your example, is a pharmacy-based app, it's hard to imagine that I couldn't do everything in the browser that I could do in a native app.
Oh, I could imagine a function from that very app.
Okay. That was egging you on there, Billy.
I suppose you could fudge a lot of this, and I'll kind of get to the point there. One of the features of that particular application that was on the desktop is you can imagine a pharmacist having to do thousands of prescriptions a day to approve them, and legally every prescription has to be approved. So he's looking at things and he's hitting the accept, and he's looking at things and hitting the accept. And what's the chances that he's going to look at some things, hit the accept, and then have something kind of kick in that goes, I shouldn't have accepted that. Let me go back and pull it back out. But if it's already kind of sent off to the server and gone, then you can't. You have to unwind everything. So what we did instead was to hold it on the client in a stateful way for, I think we did it for 30 seconds, in a little holding area that kind of sits off the side of the screen. And if he realizes, oh yeah, I shouldn't have done that, then he can go to that area and then bring that thing back. And then it automatically, he doesn't do anything to send it at the end of the 30 seconds. That happens automatically. So you could probably do that with today's browser technologies. It would have been really hard back then. This was 15 years ago. But it probably would take quite a lot longer. Anything that you're doing stateful, trying to arrange all of the plumbing to make it work. And so for me, some of the reasons why you end up doing desktop apps is it's theoretically possible to do the things that you'd like to do in the browser. It's that that will take you longer, considerably longer. I've had clients tell me that do both, that they usually do like a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 amount of time to get things done in the browser. Now, this is probably information 2 or 3 years back, and the frameworks have gotten better, so the gap probably isn't that big now. And then the other reason that people kind of talk about needing to do it is they worry about the frameworks changing and sort of obsolescing out from under them. And I confess that I don't really keep up with the frameworks as much as other people do, because I got my hands full with native stuff. Is it your perception that the frameworks is stabilized enough there that you don't have this world being pulled out from under you every few months problem that we had, say, 3-4 years ago?
I have 2 parts to my answer, I guess. One is on the web front, especially around Angular and the tool chains, they still are not nearly as productive as desktop. I will not argue that. And I'm sure I'll get yelled at by a bunch of web people that are like, oh, yes, we are, but they're not. But compared to 2 or 3 years ago, they are way better. Things are moving at a more reasonable pace. Change is much easier to manage. I think part of it is that the frameworks have stabilized, and part of it is the tool chains and tools around the tool chains have matured. So it is substantially better than it was 2 or 3 years ago. But the other piece to my answer is that there's I believe, WebAssembly, which is relatively new. Well, okay, it's not relatively new, it's new. But WebAssembly is a sea change. If I may, I remember back around the year 2000 when there was this, there was the .com, boom. Everything was like, whoa, man, the world's changing. And I would go to conferences and listen to both speakers and attendees. Everybody was excited. And there was an undercurrent debate that was happening about whether the browser should continue to be treated like a terminal, or the browser should become the new de facto client-side runtime. And that debate was starting to really get some good back and forth. And then the .bomb occurred, right? The money fell out from the web world, and it kind of derailed that whole conversation. But what we've seen in the last 10, 12 years is that I don't know that debate ever rekindled, but what happened is that people did in fact start building things like Knockout and Aurelia and AngularJS. All those early frameworks were an attempt to say, let's treat the browser like the client-side operating system. And over 12 years now, we've seen that evolve to be pretty effective, to where if you're willing to work in JavaScript, you can write pretty good apps that run in any modern browser. Now enter WebAssembly, which breaks that hegemony and says, well, really, why are we limited to one programming language? Why can't we treat the browser like a client-side
platform,
desktop platform, and write in C, C++, C#, Ruby, Rust, Go, why Python? Why do we have to do only JavaScript? And so that's where we are today. It's at the very inception of that, and I find that so a lot of the things that you talked about in terms of being stateful and the way that you think about building a smart client app are in fact possible with things like Angular. And they are also possible with WebAssembly. And then you start to think, well, all of the, at least I think this way, right? All the people that are out there maintaining ancient legacy Windows Forms and WPF apps that have been around for a long, long, long time, those exact same architectural approaches and everything else, and all of your knowledge translates into something like Blazor or Uno running on WebAssembly. And
Yeah.
the only difference, really, especially when you think about Blazor, is that your UI is created with HTML and CSS instead of XAML or Windows Forms designer stuff.
Yeah. And I'm perfectly fine with that kind of direction, in the sense that I don't hate the browser in and of itself. The browser is an obstacle to me getting stuff to my users that I want to get to, the snappy response, the fast development, and things like that. So if we overcome stuff like that, and the Uno platform in particular, right, which I'm spending a fair amount of time on, looks like it's moving nicely in that direction. And maybe, I don't know, I think of myself as doing new things like Uno and such, and being fairly still, even at my age, keeping up with sort of new things. But I never liked JavaScript. In fact, I don't know anybody who likes JavaScript.
Well, there's a few people out there. There's more than one.
Sure, but I mean, here, show my screen there. This is something I put up in some of the sessions that I do for my buddy David Neal, who talks about. He sells his T-shirt on Amazon. Can you get that up, Walt? And do I need to say no? I've shared.
Oops, I pressed.
There we go. And he sells a lot of these T-shirts, and that seems to be kind of one of the prevalent attitudes about it is employees must wash hands after using JavaScript. And then there's also this coffee cup, which is really, really popular.
A classic funny CSS coffee cup.
And you
still makes me laugh.
There's a kernel of humor. Anytime you have something that people kind of respond to humorously, there's a kernel of truth to it. So the JavaScript CSS world has just always felt repellent to me in favor of the other technologies. So if we get technologies and they project to the browser, but they let me do everything I want to as fast as I want to, man, I'm as happy as I could be about that.
Well, I think that's where why Rocky's so excited about the whole WebAssembly thing. And
yeah.
I think one of the things we wanted to talk about today was WebAssembly, and in particular, Rocky, you've been working with Blazor, right?
I've done a fair amount with Uno also, but yeah, I wrote a book on Blazor, so I've been spending a lot of time intimately familiar with Blazor, and so the book itself has a lot of chapters, just like how do you get started in Blazor, how do you build a server-side Blazor app, and how do you build a client-side Blazor app, and then it ends with a couple chapters on using the CSLA business object rules framework. So you can take literally the same business layer that you would have behind WPF or Windows Forms or Xamarin, and just build a Blazor UI on top of that same business layer. Largely what Billy's talking about, but that's kind of the core premise of CSLA all these years, is that if you consolidate your business layer as a set of domain objects, then CSLA helps mitigate the differences between all these different UI frameworks. And so yeah, I've been I have fallen in love with Blazor. Let's face it.
Well, I have to say, when I read your early books on, it was the business objects books, but then later your CLSA books, it really changed the way I thought about developing software, the way you had the business objects and business rules and everything else. Today, I'd rather talk about the UI part of it. But since you brought up Blazor, I saw you in a Twitter thread maybe a week ago, where somebody was basically saying, well, isn't Blazor the same as Silverlight, and I don't see any advantages? So could you spend a couple minutes and maybe explain what is WebAssembly, what its premise is, or what its benefit is to us, and then how Blazor fits into that scenario?
Absolutely. The comparison with Silverlight is hard to avoid, because I was in love with Silverlight too. The drawback Silverlight had, well, I should start with the advantage Silverlight had, is it was essentially a way of taking all of your, at the time, WPF skills and just carrying them forward into a cross-browser, cross-platform runtime environments. So I could write XAML-based .NET apps that would run on the Mac or Windows or whatever, phones. The drawback with it is that it used plugin technology, and it was not a native, it was not a web standard, it was a web plugin. So roll forward in time to now, WebAssembly was created initially by Mozilla and the Firefox people, and they worked hard to gather a coalition of other vendors like Google and Microsoft and IBM and a whole bunch of, but they worked really hard to create this assembly language runtime as a standard for browsers. And so the base level here for WebAssembly is that you think, well, we were in a world where I had HTML, CSS sitting on top of JavaScript, and that was it, right? And you could do other programming languages as long as they could transpile into JavaScript, because only JavaScript would run in the browser. And now what WebAssembly does is it says, well, right alongside JavaScript, so you still have HTML, CSS at the top, right? And then down underneath, you still have JavaScript, but right next to JavaScript is an assembly language compiler and runtime. And so anything that can compile into assembly language can now run in the browser alongside JavaScript. And so, of course, Mozilla started with C and then C++ and kind of graduated from that model, which makes sense, right? If you can compile C and C++ such that they can run in your runtime, that's like the base of everything. And then the Mono open source version of .NET looked at all that and they're like, oh, I bet we could make .NET, we could make Mono run on top of WebAssembly too. And so they did that. And then I wouldn't even say the ASP.NET team, but Jeff Sanderson looked at that and is like, well, if .NET runs in the browser, I bet I could create a UI framework that ran on top of Mono. And that was the early origins of what we now think of as Blazor. And of course, now Microsoft has decided that they're going to make this official. So the Blazor sitting on Mono is going to become a released product, I think, next month. And now in .NET 5, instead of Mono, my understanding is it'll actually possibly be .NET Core. It'll be .NET 5, right? But that's the Microsoft. I think what's so important to understand here is that WebAssembly is a web standard that was not created by Microsoft, has nothing to do with Microsoft. It's primarily driven from the Mozilla Foundation, and has become embedded now and adopted by Chrome, Chromium. Apple finally put it in their browser. So all of the major browsers now directly support WebAssembly, and they have to, because it's a W3C standard.
And that's beneficial to us because we know that current browsers and future browsers will support it.
Correct.
And then,
it also, sorry, Walt. It also means that it's not just Microsoft, right? If you like Go or Golang, which is a pretty popular. I mean, that's what Kubernetes and Docker, they all use that. There is a lightweight UI framework for Golang too. So this is not a Microsoft thing. It's just Microsoft had this advantage of having spent decades writing smart client UI frameworks. And you can quibble about the strong and weak points of the VB world and the Windows Forms and WPF, and right, they've all had good and bad points, and that's part of why when I look at Blazor, a lot of what's in there, the way that the Blazor UI framework works, you can see where they learned lessons. It's like, data binding in back in the VB and even Windows Forms days was powerful but iffy. And it got really good but complicated in WPF, and now it's just like smooth as silk, the way that they chose to do it in Blazor, and I think they borrowed ideas and lessons from the old Microsoft UI frameworks, and also from modern web frameworks like Angular, where they're like, oh yeah, if we marry these ideas and we can come up with something that does all the cool stuff that, for example, you can do with XAML binding, but I think often in an easier way.
So, sorry, go ahead, Walt.
No, go ahead, Billy.
So theoretically, you can have any number of language, UI, platform, things, whatever you want. So Blazor looks like it's pretty good. And you mentioned one other one that I wasn't even familiar with. And then we've got the Uno platform. How about things like Google Flutter? Do you see things that are going to try to project to the browser kind of all coming together for that? Because right now, Flutter is more targeting iOS and Android, but they're trying to add, or at least it's heavily rumored that they're going to start to reach into the browser. Do you think it's going to be a world where we kind of pick and choose the thing we want? Because, I mean, of course, I love XAML. I think XAML's a very extraordinarily powerful markup language and is going to be probably further along than Blazor in terms of some of the stuff it'll do. Or do you see it coalescing around Blazor, or maybe just maybe not that, but that one UI stack will eventually take today? What's your feel for that?
I like competition. I would hate to see where, like, for example, Blazor becomes the de facto UI standard for all of the web, or for all client apps. I think that's the other thing, is that we're not talking about the web anymore. We're at least in my mind, we're talking about a world where for most apps, the browser is the runtime. And so, you say it's phones, it's desktops, it's everything, right? So it's no longer a web thing. It's a client thing, and the browser is your runtime. And I would very much dislike it if there's only one winner for, it's like, oh, if I want to write a client-side app, the only option is Blazor.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that if you look throughout at least my career, every time that there's a challenger to some UI framework, Angular gains a great deal of momentum, and then React comes along, and there's crossbreeding, and a lot of, and sometimes one will adopt ideas from the other, or sometimes a third technology comes in that's like, oh, I'll take the best from this, I'll take the best from that, and we'll create something even better. And that innovation is critical. I can't imagine we are anywhere close to the pinnacle of what we can achieve in terms of developer productivity and providing great user experiences. I don't think that's at all true.
Yeah,
and I agree with that too.
I think things like the Golang UI framework and Blazor and Uno, you say, well, HTML, CSS, and XAML are two different approaches to solving the same problem. And I could imagine, for example, if you took the, you guys are familiar, of course, with the JavaScript book, and then the JavaScript the good parts book, right? HTML and CSS suffer from decades of cruft and hacks, and the Blazor war, or browser wars of days gone by, and everybody was trying to create creative ways to make you use Chrome instead of Safari or whatever. I strongly suspect that if somebody sat down, they could create a new markup language that's very much like HTML, CSS, that also has a lot of the formalized structure of XAML and gets rid of the cruft of you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's the kind of innovation that I would hope will happen as we go forward.
That's one good direction for innovation. And then I could see another one being the sort of low-code type of approach that we had with FoxPro and Access and even VB back in the 90s, and we don't have right now. That there's a layer of people underneath professional developers that need something that's far more approachable than what we have today. And I see a lot of demand for that, which is why things like Flutter, and then there are some other no-code platforms, low-code platforms I see. So I'm hoping that there will be innovation in
of course, Microsoft is positioning Power Apps and the Power Platform for that area, and that's a whole nother discussion we could have. Another fascinating thing that Microsoft is doing there for what they're calling citizen developers.
Good phrase. And it's true. Inside of Magenic, our internal systems were slowly but surely being rebuilt in Power Apps. And it's interesting. I look at Power Apps today as being kind of like VB1 or VB2, where if you have enough stick-to-itiveness, you can do some pretty amazing stuff. But they haven't hit the tooling and so forth is not yet like at a VB3 level where you've got a decent debugger and
right. That's why I've done some Power App development, and if you're coming in from a developer perspective, you're missing a lot of tools. You don't have a way to debug easily. You don't have the ability to do source control in the way that you expect. But if you're not a developer,
I don't know, even the citizen developer, because most of what's being built inside of Magenic is largely done by my IT director used to be a developer, but hasn't been for a very long time. So I think he's a citizen developer.
Yeah, and I worked on a project last year, and one of my teammates who's in IT but not a programmer at all, and not interested in it, she wrote a number of flows, or Power Automate, I think it's called now, and applications for her use, and she felt really empowered, because she didn't have to come to somebody and say, "Can you build this for me?" She was able to figure out it on her own. But again, that's another topic. I'd love to have somebody from the Power Apps team come on and talk about it sometime. Did you want to show anything in Blazor before we turn it over to Billy?
Yeah, if I can.
Sure. I think we're just going to go over a little bit of time. It's okay. There's nobody coming in to shut us down. So if you got time, Billy.
Oh yeah, I'm cool.
All right. I'd like to see what Rocky's got here. Let's get his screen up.
I'll keep it short and concise. But this is a Blazor example app that's in the samples folder from the CSLA framework, and much of it is the standard Blazor sample. But this list people page is actually talking to a backend using CSLA objects, and uses some interesting features that I think are interesting from a Blazor UI perspective. So if I try to add a person, I'm not logged in, so it won't let me add or edit people. And if I log in, and I've got this set up just for an example purpose, right? So it logs me in as a user. But now if I go back to list people and I say, oh, I'd like to edit this person, now I get this edit page. And on one level, you can say, oh, this is a very browser-like experience. But then on another level, you might say, well, as I'm typing, notice that the name field is required. I type Fred, and now it's saying, well, it's always saying person name required. That's just informational text. But you'll notice that it's switched, keystroke by keystroke. And if I start with a capital letter, then it's happy. It's no longer telling me, well, you probably want your name to be capitalized. And also notice that as I'm typing, it's in real time tracking the name length, and it knows that this is not a new, because I'm not creating a new person, I'm editing an old person. And it also knows that I've changed data, so I could actually save these changes, right? This is just a super lightweight way of demonstrating that what I'm getting here is true keystroke by keystroke smart client behaviors.
But yet it's running in a browser.
And yet it's running in a browser. And there was no complexity to it, because Blazor is a smart client technology. So behind the scenes, for example, my name property, I have it flagged as being required, so that part shows up. And then because I'm using the CSLA rules engine, here's my informational text that I'm showing, and I'm checking the case of the first letter. And this app, which I didn't show you, has got a weird, some business person said, well, we don't want Z's in people's names. I don't know why. And well, it makes for a good demo is why.
Yeah.
And then also it's calculating the letter count, right? But this is all CSLA stuff. If we actually look at the edit page, this is the page itself. The reason that we couldn't get there until we logged in is because it requires that you be an admin user to edit this information.
And that is a attribute that's supplied by.
This is Blazor, right?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, and what's interesting is this, everything that you see here that I'm showing you works exactly the same, whether it's running on a web server using server-side Blazor or is running in the client via WebAssembly. That's one of the powerful parts about Blazor that I think you can literally write your app such that it deploys to the web server or to the client or both. And I think the both is important because it means that if I detect that my user is coming with some ancient device that's super slow and can barely limp along, I might run this on the server and treat the browser as a terminal. But if the user is coming with a modern, 6-core phone, right, or modern laptop or iPad or whatever, I'll run this on the client because it makes the whole system infinitely more scalable if I'm using the client-side CPU and memory, right?
Right.
That is just so reminiscent because the most popular library I ever wrote was for data validation for Windows Forms. And I did it through extended properties, which kind of expresses itself in code, not unlike that. And that was dependent on stateful execution right there on the client, keystroke by keystroke. And to see now that kind of capability is available here, yeah, helps me understand that we're reaching parity with a lot of the stuff that we've taken for granted in more native environments. So that's good.
Well, I can see that we need to spend more time talking about Blazor for one. We haven't just touched the surface of what the code can do. And Rocky alluded to their server-side and client-side Blazor. And those are all fascinating topics in among themselves. I think we're at time though, so we'll stop there and maybe we'll get somebody from the Blazor team. I know Billy, you and I were talking about having somebody come on from the Uno team, which has taken a similar approach, but instead of writing your UI in Razor and HTML, I use XAML instead. So yeah, so that'll be a future show there. Billy, I think it's time for you to show. You had something you wanted to share with us.
Oh yeah, let me bring that up. Let's see, there it is. Yeah, I was talking about early in the show about interaction patterns being sort of very heavily on the UX side. I'm not really content to do sort of the normal standard everyday interaction patterns, even though they are just fine for a broad range of apps. And there's going to be a lot of situations where standard interaction patterns, let's say the hamburger menu, for example, is kind of a widespread standard interaction pattern. There's nothing wrong with it. But there are situations where to provide something more suited to the purpose, faster, more elegant, feels better, that sometimes I like to be able to do that in native platforms. And one of the things that I saw, you can bring me back to my screen now, is actually you can see it in Windows. Because if I go here and I hit the A, and a lot of people, I'm surprised the number of people don't know you can do this. If I hit the A, what I get is this. And now I can go to directly to a letter. There are certain kinds of data sets, and the apps in Windows 10 would be an example where they're easily alphabetized and people think of them that way. And this turns out to be just a very easy, slick way to get to some things.
This is what you call a jump list then?
This is called a jump list. And it's actually in places people don't expect. For example, it's also in Groove. So that if I want to go to all the artists named P, then I see Porcupine Tree. Rocky and I have talked about Porcupine Tree in the past. So I like jump lists, and I decided, since they don't exist in the WPF library, that for desktop development, I would make one. I just got this idea sort of early in a weekend, and before the weekend was out, I had it. It's actually a control, so that I've thrown some names at it here, a list of names, and I get the thing there. The letters that don't have any are grayed out, but the ones that do, you can just go straight to one like that. So that is a pattern that if somebody likes, they could get my control and do it. And by the way, it's data templated. The one on the left there is made to look like the Windows menu, but over there you can see I just pulled a random data template out so that I could show that there were records using a data template in XAML. So the jump list is an interaction pattern. That's an example of the sort of thing that if it fits a particular user experience, and we typically go through design sessions to try to find interaction patterns that really make sense for that particular class of users. I like the fact that I can actually just craft that user experience pattern and not take too long to do it. This is another one of those things, I don't know, I guess you could probably do this in a browser if you worked on it. You could certainly do it in Blazor if you worked on it long enough. But I love my XAML, and I knocked that out in XAML in just a little bit over a day. It was a lot of fun.
then you took advantage of some of the XAML and WPF. I assume that was a WPF app.
It was a WPF app. Yeah.
So you took advantage of data templates and the list binding and
all that great stuff built in.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how a lot of those concepts have jumped the barrier into things like Angular.
Yeah.
Right? It's like I remember when this came out in early 2007. We talked about this last week, I think. It's like, this is fascinating the way Microsoft was thinking about the whole data binding. And again, Rocky brought this up earlier. Is Microsoft has spent 25 years thinking about UI, and like you said, not all of them were successful, right? Or they were successful. Right. They were successful in some parts. Like everybody derides Windows Forms now and WebForms now, but in 2002, when WebForms came out, it was revolutionary.
Absolutely. I think, hindsight's 2020, and at any point in time, I think all of us felt there was plenty of room to criticize, but there was also plenty of room to love every version of the UI frameworks as they came out. And what I think is, what I think is most compelling is how the product groups inside of Microsoft have learned from their predecessors. Each iteration gets better, easier, more powerful, more productive.
More flexible and more adaptable to modern technologies. I mean, I consider Windows Forms a pretty dramatic success. There are billions of dollars of software written for Windows Forms, and there are thousands and thousands of businesses that run on that software. But of course, we did a lot of Windows Forms, and then XAML really, really dramatically improved on that, particularly. And it's interesting to me that Windows Forms, one of the biggest problems was it was made for kind of static screens. And HTML did a job of adapting to the size of the monitor and the size of the window, and Windows Forms was pretty bad at that. But XAML then leaped over HTML in terms of the ability to do responsive design. So yeah, we keep getting better as time goes on, and that
means is good.
Yeah,
that's good for all of us, right? Because the technologies that we get to use are better, and it's like now we got Blazor, and there's it's exciting to be a developer in this space, which is great. It means I got another 5 or 10 years of building cool stuff using whatever technology comes to the top. And with that, I think we've run out of time.
You can go a lot longer than that, even with the gray beard, my friend.
Yeah, I want to retire someday. So, Rocky, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Next week, we're going to have Renee Schulte on, and he's going to be talking about spatial computing. So I'm looking forward to that one too. Until next time, we'll see you on the Desktop Dev Show.
Thanks, Rocky. See you later, Walt.
All right.